So today it's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Janice Harvey. Janice is a retired teacher, now a scholar in residence at Dawson College, and a member of the Centre d'Histoire des Régulations Sociales at l'UQAM. Her research focuses mainly on gender issues and institutions of social regulation in Protestant Montreal, and her study on child charities, their benevolent design, was published by McGill Queen's University Press last year. Excellent book, by the way. You should get it. Her current research looks at changing models of services for boys using the example of the boys' home, Weardale House. And Janice, on a personal note, was a major inspiration to me. I did a thesis on charities in the 19th century in Quebec City, Anglophone charities. And Janice knows kind of the French historiography, the English historiography, manages to weave all those different threads together. And I read hundreds of books. And Janice, when I read Janice's thesis, it was a real eye-opener for me because she manages to kind of put everything together in very clear, concise, accessible language. So she's a fantastic writer. And, I highly recommend her book, which takes her thesis to the next level. So if you have any questions during the presentation, reminder, add them to the Q&A box, not the chat box. I guess over to you, Janice. I will turn the mic over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Patrick for his introduction and say what a pleasure it is to participate in this Lunch and Learn. Their Benevolent Design, Conservative Women and Protestant Child Charity in Montreal, examines women's benevolence using a study of two Protestant child charities, the Montreal Protestant Orphans Asylum and the Montreal Ladies Benevolent Society, and the women who ran them for a 100-year period. Changes to the economy, combined with massive immigration and urbanization, meant that poverty was a way of life for most low-wage workers and recent immigrants, and many families were desperately in need of help. Images in the illustrated press in the 1870s highlighted this misery. A winter scene by Auguste Trichon is an excellent example of this. It appeared in L'Opinion Publique in 1875. This image of dead children in their lodgings, entitled Frozen to Death, was on the front page of the Canadian Illustrated News in 1872. Without a public poor relief system, any aid that people might receive was largely left to the private sector. In Montreal, social services evolved along confessional lines with separate Catholic and Protestant networks. McGill Queen's used this image by N.W. Ridley, called The Parlor and the Pavement, as the book's cover. It appeared in L'Opinion Publique in 1876 and depicts an abandoned mother and child, now homeless, taking momentary refuge on the steps of the home of a well-to-do family. As members of the city elite, the people partying under the bright parlor lights had a lot more control over what aid might be available to her than did this destitute woman. Despite the sympathy the image elicits, the article that accompanied it parroted increasingly popular liberal beliefs about poverty being the fault of the poor. Influenced by these beliefs, men of the Protestant elite were hesitant to organize an aid network that they feared might create dependency on relief. It was elite women who responded first to social inequality, and they continued to do so throughout the century, running almost all the services and institutions for women and children. The first such effort was the Female Benevolent Society, formed in 1815. This is a drawing of their house on Lewis Street. When the FBS closed its doors in 1822, some of the women who were members formed the Protestant Orphan Asylum to take in the children. The Ladies Benevolent Society was created 10 years later in 1832 in the face of widespread need resulting from the cholera epidemic. It admitted both women and children. From now on, I will refer to these associations as the POA and the LBS. The POA helped 1,200 children aged 2 to 14, from 1822 to 1921. Here we see the home they built in 1849 on St. Catherine between Stanley and Drummond. This image is from 1875. This is a sketch of the LBS building, built in 1856 on Ontario between Blurry and City Councillor. The image is from 1920 after several additions had been made. The LBS was much bigger than the POA. It helped 3,700 children from 1832 to 1921, but the majority of them remained less than 1 year. The LBS also admitted old women, some of whom remained for many years, but its main work was always with children. When I refer to the women who ran the two charities and their benevolence as conservative in the book's title, I'm adopting the definition used by several American historians. In their studies of women's activism, they distinguish between conservative, benevolent women and those with a reform approach. In this context, conservative refers to a worldview based on a hierarchical social order, the central importance of tradition, social status, family, and religion, as well as the duty of the privileged to help the poor. That is what we could call a needs-based response to poverty. These women hope to alleviate poverty and the problems it posed for families, not to reform the poor or eradicate poverty, as some groups formed later in the century hoped to do. So who were these committee women? Over the 19th century, 589 women served on either the POA or the LBS committees, or both. As members of the city's bourgeoisie, they came from families of merchants, manufacturers, doctors, lawyers, financiers. Many were linked by family connections. There was almost always a representative of the Ross McCord Tylees, the coarse Savage Lymans, the Muffets, Greenshields, Armour Ramseys, Mackenzies, Ogdens, Evans, and the various Torrance and Molson families. Serving on a charity board was an accepted, even expected activity for, quote, ladies of the elite. Since charity was an integral part of the institutional structures that underpin class relations, it reinforced a family's social importance and their moral authority. In other words, their social status. In many ways, this was a sociable activity. Women worked alongside friends, relatives, and neighbors. But managing a charity also required a great deal of challenging administrative tasks and serious responsibilities. Not surprisingly, if one thinks of modern organizations, the work was not evenly spread among members. The majority of members remained for less than 5 years, rarely attended meetings, never supervised the institutions as monthly visitors, and did not participate in fundraising. That left the bulk of the work and much of the decision-making to a small group of dedicated and talented members who invested a substantial amount of time and effort. Here are some of these long-term dedicated members. Jane Davidson Ross and Mary Ross Tylee worked both as first directress and treasurer. Another of her daughters, Anne Ross McCord, and her granddaughter, Annie McCord. This group of linked families worked for many years on the POA committee, holding executive positions for much of the 19th century. In a similar way, the sisters Fanny and Jane Evans consecutively held the job of LBS secretary from 1856 to 1892. Mary Corse Lyman was a very active long-term member of both committees. Harriet Reeler initiated several major reforms as LBS first directress, and Elizabeth Greenshields, seen here with her daughters, was also an active long-term member and directress. Some members made their contribution in one area, such as fundraising. One of them was Mary Ferrier, who called on her extensive contacts within the city's financial and industrial elite to serve as charity collector. Most managers were married, but a number, including Annie McCord, who we just met, were single. Eliza Ross, another of Jane Ross's daughters, and Louisa Goddard Frothingham were other single members who were very active long-term on the committees. Eliza served on both committees, and Louisa spearheaded a number of reforms in the POA. As private associations, annual subscriptions paid by members served as the basis of their funding. This was one way that women could support the charities even if they weren't able to give their time working on the committee itself. Although several members left small bequests in their will, only a few were able to use their personal wealth to help the charities. One was Louisa Frothingham, who married J.H.R. Molson in her late 40s and donated money to both the POA where she worked, and you can see here also to the LBS, which was much more in need of money. Another was Agnes Budden King, who both her and her husband, E.H. King, were large benefactors of $25,000 each just at the turn of the century. Class was an ever-present feature of charitable work. Charity was seen as a gift, not a right. And in their discourse, the managers distinguished between the women they helped or hired as women and themselves with the social status of, quote, ladies with a capital L. The dynamic of charity was interactive to some extent, nonetheless. Families integrated charity into their survival strategies, and the study found several examples of agency in relation to admissions. Furthermore, parents tended to remove children as soon as they were able to, despite rules on minimum one-year residence, and resisted any refusal to discharge their children, sometimes by stealing them from the institution. Nonetheless, admission and discharge policies were controlled by the boards. Moreover, families had no control over the internal regime, and although managers were willing to help families, they were also determined to teach children what they considered appropriate social norms and to ensure their religious salvation. Class and gender intersect in the ladies' charitable work and their response to poverty, but gender was the dominant factor. As we have seen, ladies worked together on female committees made up of close networks of kinship and friendship. They brought with them a supportive and shared women's culture and value system based in humanism and religious dedication that influenced their protective, personal approach to charity work. This approach was centered on their specific institution and the needs of the residents, what I have referred to as a person-centered approach. This kept them focused and pragmatic. The ladies on these two committees worked in the social sphere, where charity management was accepted despite the public nature of many of its components. But the Montreal managers integrated some aspects of the prevalent gendered separate spheres ideology that proposed to limit female incursions into the world of politics and business. For example, they accepted norms of propriety by not speaking at their annual public meetings, which would have been attended by men as well. Furthermore, out of respect for the belief that men and women had different special natures, by the last half of the 19th century, the allocated activities recognized as male, such as investment and building construction, to men's committees formed specifically to assume these tasks. Yet these same gendered notions empowered them when it came to policy. The care of children and managing a home were both seen as domestic by nature and based on women's moral and religious authority, hence within the female sphere of competence. This gave them the confidence to persevere in the face of financial difficulties and to base their policies on their years of experience, not new trends. Still, their gender did bring with it some limitations that impacted on their work. As women, they did not have the same freedom as men to travel to rescue children from abusive situations, for example, and were reluctant to publicly prosecute apprenticeship masters in cases of abuse. All these factors, class power, their conservative benevolent approach, and their gendered beliefs converged to influence the ladies, their benevolent design, and policy development. Their benevolent design was anchored by their evangelical faith in religious salvation and structured by their determination to re-educate children into useful citizens. Nonetheless, despite this regulation context, overall the ladies respected parental rights and accepted to provide temporary care for children. Although budget constraints often resulted in minimalist conditions, both committees developed strict policies on education, diet, exercise, and sanitation to maintain what they believed were at least adequate internal conditions. Even here, though, class was visible in debates over the need for butter or whole milk and anything else that might be considered an extravagance. Policy changes were influenced by several factors, and in the process, the charity managers demonstrated a remarkable flexibility for volunteer committees. An increased recognition of the need for child protection led to the modification of policies and generally improved conditions. The demand for new services resulted in adjusted admission policies. The POA opened a separate annex to admit orphan children during the epidemic of 1848 and opened a convalescent home inside their new building on Summerhill and Côte de Neige in 1910. The LBS was designed for children of destitute one-parent families, but it gradually accepted more children from needy two-parent families, as well as those with working parents, and was certified as an industrial school in 1883. Although this part of the institution was meant for children thought to be at risk of imminent delinquency, the LBS did not separate court children from the others, believing all of them were endangered to some extent. Changes were made to placement policies to provide more protection and better supervision for children who could not return to their own family. Both apprenticeship age and fees were raised, a visiting system, pre-inspection, and trial periods were introduced. Adoption was limited to childless families. Nonetheless, problems and even some serious cases of abuse occurred. The POA removed adoption completely from its charter after the death of a 5-year-old little girl in 1855. Years of dealing with contractual violations and even sexual and physical abuse, as well as the difficulty of intervening to protect the children who were apprentices, gave the committee a base of experience. As a result, by 1883 really, both committees decreased the use of apprenticeship and introduced a policy of prolonged institutionalization, at least for girls who trained inside the charity as upper servants and left to go directly into service at the age of 17. The POA used this policy for a few boys, but some boys were still apprenticed by both committees. By the end of the century and into the 20th, the committees came into conflict with two movements in childcare and philanthropy in general, both foster care and scientific charity. They argued against placing out or foster care, which advocated placing children in families without a contract, because years of experience had shown them that even with the contract, the children had not always been protected. They believed their institution provided a safer environment and superior training. They rejected the underlying premise of so-called scientific charity, which advocated coordinating and rationalizing relief in a city to reduce dependence and to increase self-reliance among the poor. They found this position too restrictive and were determined to both maintain existing services for families and to defend their institutional autonomy. In the process, they met with criticism from many among the male elite. This also highlighted the ways in which these benevolent women differed from women involved in social reform, like the Local Council of Women or the YWCA, both of whom supported these movements. Despite budget problems, the ladies were determined to make their institutions into homes. They did this by attempting to create what could be described as fictive families. Everyone ate together in the dining room. Everyone attended daily family prayers together twice a day, and elaborate family celebrations were held at Easter and Christmas with donations from the public. The LBS held their Christmas celebration inside the institution, but the POA held theirs at the home of Louise of Rothingham, seen here on De Rocher and Pine Avenue. By the end of the century, summer was filled with picnics and other family outings. One of the things I wanted to try to evaluate was children's experience of institutionalization. Although the ladies' policies were basically protective, children had lost or been separated from their families. When they crossed the threshold of one of these charities, almost everything must have seemed different to them. The routine, the rules on cleanliness, obedience, and silence, the separation of children by age and gender, even material factors like the size of 2 3-story buildings. If we juxtapose this Notman photo of houses in a poor district from which many of the children might have come with this 1909 photo of the LBS building, one can understand how children might have been immediately intimidated right on the doorstep. This photo of the LBS children in the institution's backyard, lined up dressed in their Sunday uniforms with their hair cut short for easy maintenance and lice control, gives some inkling of the source of another possible emotional impact. Did the uniformity that existed inside an institution make the children feel different than others they met on the street on their way to church or their former playmates? And did this bother them? Testimonies from individuals who were in child charities in the mid-20th century indicate that this was often a factor, as was being separated from their younger siblings who they could no longer protect all the time. Some children found the situation emotionally difficult, and a number ran away. Others found some security in this structured life, especially if they had come from turbulent families beforehand, and they found it hard to leave their new institutional home. Many of the children wrote letters back to the committees or the matrons after they left, asking for advice or help with future projects. A few returned to contribute their skilled labor by fixing plumbing or laying new floors, and several made financial contributions. Certainly these children recognized the charities as their substitute homes and appreciated the training they had been given there. Over the course of the 19th century, the two committees demonstrated remarkable level of independence and professionalism. Bringing their maternal and caring perspective to their work with children, the ladies structured their societies and their benevolent design around religious salvation, education, and providing a home for children who found themselves in need of one. Their responses were limited by their attitudes to poverty, their suspicion of working-class morality, their belief in a hierarchical society and the superiority of middle-class culture, as well as the limitations imposed by their gender. Nonetheless, they recognized the need of poor families for help and were willing to provide this help. In this way, they forged a central place for themselves in the city's network of Protestant social services and provided critical support for families in crisis or those needed long-term solutions for childcare difficulties. If anyone is interested in reading the book, several libraries have copies. McGill Queens is offering a 25% discount if you purchase the book online. Use the code MQ25. Thank you. Okay. Okay, just a second. I'm trying to find the stop share button. All right.
Thank you very much, Janice. So I'll start with some questions. Reminder to everybody that please, if you have any questions for Janice, which I hope you do, please put them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. I'll start with a question. Today the topic of Victorian child charities inevitably raises questions about abuse and neglect, and there's certainly, that's compounded a bit by the evidence of the widespread systemic abuse in Indigenous charities, residential schools. The evidence of this abuse was not necessarily preserved for posterity in sources. They didn't necessarily write about it. To what extent did you find evidence of mistreatment in the institutions you studied? And if the sources don't specifically mention abuse, how do you account for the likelihood that it may still have occurred in these institutions?
Okay, but there were a few examples. I mean, the minutes are quite thorough, really. And they do testify to a several examples where either a child uh, complained about extreme punishment, let's say being strapped, or in the 20th century, there were two examples where the Society of Protection of Women and Children raised questions based on a testimony by the sewing woman, and a father had made a complaint. In all of these instances, and also examples where the visiting ladies who went to the institution every month, usually at least once a week, sometimes almost every day, would raise things at the committee meetings. They were always investigated, and there were two instances where matrons were literally fired. One instance where a teacher was reprimanded and subsequently fired. And then in the 20th century, in response to the Society of Protection of Women and Children's investigation, the LBS decided that they would use a regulation school strap, because before that they had been using a rubber hose to discipline the children when they were getting out of control in the schoolroom. So I had this impression that since there were indications in the minutes of investigations that probably anytime there had been any complaints, they had indeed looked into it. Now, they tended, though, to agree with what we could call, what did they call it? Moderate discipline or adequate discipline. So there clearly was some discipline going on. The LBS, remember, had about 100 children, sometimes more than 150 at one point in the institution. All the older children would have been in a schoolroom together. So the teachers were clearly trying to maintain discipline. And it seems like that was mainly where any of this instances of inordinate discipline that seemed to occur was in the schoolroom.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Carol Mindel. Did the societies do more to help the single mothers beyond taking care of their children for a period of time? Did they provide food for the mothers to take home, money to pay rent, firewood, whatever?
No, no, they didn't do that. But what they did do, the LBS was originally created for widows and children. Okay, the POA basically was an orphanage. As soon as the LBS existed, the POA was an orphanage just for actual orphans. They very rarely admitted children who weren't orphans. But the LBS, seeing as their special function being women and children, often allowed women to, or admitted women into the institution. And I argued in my book that that's one of the ways that families, certainly women with children, tried to circumvent the rule about board, because the institution is created for destitute families, not families who can afford to pay board. So the mother would enter the institution with her child, with her children, and then when she would leave, the institution would always allow the children to remain, and the mother would pay part of her wage as board. These mothers and children who entered together tended to be very destitute. They were on the street, they had no home, etc. So they were really some of the saddest cases in the institution. Otherwise, no, the institution didn't provide care for mothers who were living outside of the institution. They could have visit their children once a week on Saturday. There were, though, other institutions in Montreal run by women, of the elite women, that did provide some care or some services, let's say, for women. The Harvey Institute, which was created in 1848, started to run sewing rooms and a servant repository to help women get jobs, certainly by the 1855. Okay, and then those industrial rooms for sewing existed right to the end of the century, and they used a policy whereby they always gave wages to the women, and they prided themselves on providing a wage that was larger than what normally would have been paid, even though there was a recession in the 1870s, well, really from 1870 to 90, they didn't change their wage so that the women could still always, and of course they ran into debt, but they managed to get out of debt by the end. So there were some services being provided for them, but not by these two charities, at least not outside services.
Um, Two related questions now. Have there been studies on the adults who came out of these charities, and if so, what was found? And I guess the other question is from Lauren Houston, where you cite some of this, testimonies about how children felt about their status compared to other children. Where were you able to find testimony like this? Are there more studies like this that look at how adults looking back on their experience growing up in these child charities in the Victorian era or the 19th century,
No.
long 19th century?
There's it's difficult to find any study that includes testimonies from children in the 19th century, but there's several American studies that look at that were able to get testimonies from children in the 20th century. And one of the things that those children tend to talk about, there's two positions, obviously. Some of the children were very appreciative of the education they got, of the care that they got, of the skills training that they were able to have. Others talked about, the routine, the dullness of the situation, and particularly the thing that they tended to talk about the most and that they found the most difficult was the separation of children. So a young child, or let's say a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old who'd been accustomed to looking after their little brother and sister, was, if they entered a child charity, would be separated from them, and they'd only see those little children maybe at the supper table, and they'd be at a different section of the supper table as well. So that was the thing that the children tended to find the most traumatic. And of course, just that's the bigness of the building and how that worried them. I was able to, by chance, I didn't have a way to get in touch with people that came out of the institution, particularly because of the time lag that most I was working in the 19th century. I shifted to add parts of the 20th century very late in my study. Had I been doing that right from the beginning, I might have had more success. I did meet by chance someone, a young, well, he was now an older man, obviously. He was in his 80s, I guess, who had been in the orphanage just near the turn of the century. He was working in the McGill Library as a bookbinder, and he had been taught bookbinding in the orphanage. And he and his brothers had all been taught different skills, and they all had found good employment afterwards. He had nothing but good things to say about the orphanage. I met another woman, well, she came to meet me, as a matter of fact, so I found her that way. She had been in both the LBS and the orphanage, because in the 20th century, probably by the 20s, the 1920s, younger children went into well, maybe the 30s. The younger children went into the LBS, and then when they got to a certain age, boys went to Weardale and girls went to the orphanage. So she said she remembered the LBS, the matron and the staff, as being very condescending and very class bias, treating them as charity children, below them, etc. But once she got to the orphanage, it was great. And Eatons came with rows of dresses for them to choose. They did ballet classes. They walked to school. They went to the Victoria School on de Maisonneuve at the corner of, I guess, St. Mark. So she had only good things to say about the orphanage. She had been very well trained and become a businesswoman. So she said that some of the people that she knew had also had good experiences. So there's one book about an institution in Ontario. I'm trying to remember the name. The name of the institution is Hespler, but I can't remember the name of the author of the book. It was, again, just at the turn of the century, and those children tended to have very negative remembrances of the institution, mainly because the staff had been so abusive. But that wasn't, and even in the books on the 1950s, none of them talk about abusive staff. They talk about emotional trauma that they felt as children being abandoned by their families, mostly also, that sense of abandonment. That didn't happen as much in Montreal. Remember, the orphanage, the children don't have families anymore. And in the LBS, the families come to visit once a week. So, and more than 50% of the children are in the institution for less than a year, and 33% are less than 3 months. So they probably always knew that eventually they'd be able to go home. So that might have lessened the trauma that they felt.
Okay, thank you for that. A question from Lauren Drew. Your presentation focused on Protestant women organizing child welfare. What other child welfare organizers were active at that time in Montreal, particularly, on the Catholic side? And maybe that was also segregated by language to a certain extent.
Yeah.
What differences were there in their philosophies and their treatment toward children on the Catholic side compared to the Protestant side?
Well, the Catholic charities are almost exclusively run by the nuns, and there were several different orphanages or institutions run by the Grey Nuns or the Sisters of Providence. I think the main difference in attitude would have been the emphasis on religion. So there would have been religious symbols everywhere. There would have been, I'm sure, much more emphasis on religion. In the studies that I've read about the Catholic charities, there don't seem to be a lot of different attitudes. And they run schools inside their charities. They teach children domestic skills and those types of things. There were also in the city industrial schools, which were centered, again, in the Catholic side, run by the nuns or the Brothers of Charity, which would have been centered more on skill training, apprenticeship type training. The LBS was also an industrial school, but unlike the Catholic charities, the difference in emphasis, the LBS was mostly a child charity with in the 19th century, only a few of the children were in the industrial school. In the 20th century was maybe a third of the children, but they never made any distinction between whether a child had been sent in by the court or the city mayor, or whether they'd been placed by their parents. So the fact that it was an industrial school was, in a sense, just mainly a financial advantage for the institution because they were paid board for those children by the state.
I'd like you to talk a bit about social regulation. I mean, you're part of the Centre d'Histoire de Régulation Sociale. Many scholars who use that approach argue that the elites who started and ran charities did so less out of altruism and perhaps compassion and more to, preserve order, providing the barest minimal aid necessary to prevent poverty from destabilizing society while protecting their own class privilege in these institutions. Your account seems a lot more sympathetic to a lot of the women who ran these institutions. Could you explain that? Were your charities different because they dealt with children rather than adults, because they were Protestant? Do you find that some of the scholarship out there is too pessimistic? So, some thoughts there.
Well, I think the difference is basically gender. Indeed, a basic kind of social regulation perspective would characterize the charities run by men. Okay, so the Protestant House of Industry certainly took that approach. The Boys' Home didn't, because it was run by evangelical Congregationalists who were very strong on citizenship, on self-help, on social mobility, literally, and they trained the boys in that perspective. Okay, so it doesn't really sit inside a social regulation structure very, very well. But certainly the House of Industry does. I think that the institutions run by women, and that's why they existed so early in the society, in the century. But the House of Industry, created in 1817, was a joint institution, Catholic and Protestant, but was only sporadic. It existed in some years, not in others, only ever in the winter. And the Protestant House of Industry was only created in 1863. The Catholic House of Industry, St. Bridget's, or Bridget's Refuge, was created in 66, I think. So you can see that 1815, the first female charity, and then 1863, there's a big gap there. And I think that that comes down to the women's perspective, that sort of maternal, caring perspective, but even more so their conservative approach, that they really did believe in the importance of religion, but also that sort of noblesse oblige, that the rich should be looking after the poor if they need help. They approached it more from a perspective of need, that if a family needed help, what I think of as realism, if a family needed help, well, then you should be helping them. That optimism that somehow they might have an influence of retraining these children, that attitude of retraining was there for sure. So in that case, in that extent, they were clearly inside social regulation. So you could think of what they're going to do with those children when they get them inside an institution, once they've admitted them in, which already was not being very social regulation about it, to allow the children to come in. They then basically are trying to civilize them or socialize them, which clearly is a form of regulation. But they were able, I think, to moderate the very moralistic and negative attitude that the men who were proponents of liberalism had. And so I think mostly it's gender.
Thank you. A question here from Gabrielle Kathleen Mashnik-Kekesi. Thank you for your presentation. I imagine that accessing the history of children's emotional experiences in these homes can be difficult. Can you tell us a little bit about more, other than photographs, can you tell us a bit more about the sources you used and the process for your research?
Okay. Well, I was lucky in that both of the charities have merged in 1946. They became Summerhill Homes, which was a place with families, and it was like group homes. Their papers then were picked up by the Protestant network, and they belong to Batshaw right now. Okay, so they're sitting in the bizarrely enough, of course, in Canada, the Canadian archives. That particular group of records included all of the minutes, all of the annual reports, superintendent or matron journals, so I could see the day-by-day things that were happening in the institution. And that's why I know how often the lady visitors came, how often the first directress often was sitting in the institution, came every day, that type of thing. So there was a lot of supervision. The register for every child that came in, although they're single line entries, not case studies, they do indicate the age of the child, the religion of they're all Protestant, the religion of the child, the circumstances of the family when they left, so how long were they there, and then where did they go? Okay, and almost all the children in the LBS, 80% go back to their parents. Okay, so again, you see that there isn't that social regulation of placing children away from their parents, separating children from families, the way that happened in a lot of other child charities, particularly in Ontario, for instance. I also had, I created a big database of all the children, and I created a database of all the women. So trying to find links between families, when did they marry, when did they join the institution compared to their marriage. So I found that women tended to join shortly after they were married. So they were married women doing social status charity work, unless they were single. So with those two databases, I was able to create all of the data to run to see how long the women worked on the committees, how long the children were there, etc. And then obviously I used a lot of secondary sources. With the LBS being an industrial school, I had access, or I used the files that exist in the the municipal files, municipal records, where you can see the children coming in because they're coming through the court. Even if it's the mayor putting them in, it's going to be the court that admits them. So I can see who was it that requested the child be admitted, how long did they stay, whether there was requests for readmissions, etc.
Okay, thank you for that. I have a question about religion. And a reminder, please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box. Is there a link between conservative, you talked about conservative and reform. Is there a link between that and specific Protestant denominations? Were the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, the members of the established churches more likely to be conservatives? And you know, the Methodists and so on more likely to have a more reform approach? What's the profile of some of the women in the charities looking at specific congregations?
Okay. Well, that's an interesting question. Most of the women, the Anglican Church had a predominant role. Okay, so, and there was interesting, there weren't many discussions or disagreements inside the committees, but one of them was religion. So in the orphanage, Anglicanism is clearly predominant. I mean, families like the McCords, staunch, probably even high Anglican families. And they, as I said, they run the committee almost for right until 1875 or so. There's always McCords on the board. In the LBS, there's more of and the Protestant Orphanage Board doesn't seem to be that bothered by this Anglican nature, let's say. The LBS has a lot more trouble with it. And in the 1840s, so quite early, it was only formed in 32, they always are going to send the children to Anglican church. The matron is always Anglican, and she takes the children. And of course, since the LBS has some women living there too, she takes the women to the Anglican church, even if they're Presbyterian. So the Presbyterian members literally walk out. They stay away for 2 years. And then finally they come back and they argue that it was just a misunderstanding. Of course, it really wasn't a misunderstanding at all. So at that point, they pass a rule that Presbyterian women will be able to go to their own church, but the children are still taken to Anglican church with the matron. Okay, and the liturgy used, I mentioned that they do daily prayer twice a day. Inside the institution is always, always use Anglican or the Episcopal liturgy. Okay, so there was a bit of a conflict. One of the biggest conflicts happens with Unitarians, who, of course, as you can imagine, talk about reform churches. They're like really on the extreme reform. Louisa Frothingham is a Unitarian. So is Mrs. Workman, okay, Martha Workman. So right after Louisa joins when she's only 18 in 1848, by 1850, she's already fighting with the committee because she's in the POA, which is a very Anglican committee. They try to make a rule that Unitarian families can't take children as apprentices. She threatens to leave if this happens. And in the end, they finally admit that they finally take that clause out. She then prints all of the rules, so publishes them in a sense at her own expense, and stays. And she's going to be a really strong member for the whole century and bucks those Anglican managers quite a lot, especially by the 1870s, once the McCords aren't really running it as much. There's very few Methodist women. As a matter of fact, I don't think I found hardly any. Although Methodism was a large part of poverty work or charity work in Ontario, it isn't a very big aspect of Montreal elite charity work. But there is some religious problems.
Another question from Mary Vipon. What can you tell us about the teachers, cooks, et cetera, who were employed at these institutions? So the people on the ground. Were they aspiring lower middle class, religiously motivated? They seem quite important because they had the most direct contact with the children.
Yeah. No, they bring the working women, or what we would think of as working women, into the register The LBS brings them into their register at one point. They tend to stay not very long. They tend to be working class. The teachers mostly also don't remain for a long time. By the 1850s, maybe 60, the LBS has literally a trained teacher always on staff. And then they have two or three other teachers who would be not so much trained. And they train some of the girls in the institution. They send them to the normal school in the 1880s so that at least two of those girls come back and work as assistant teachers. There's a few teachers that remain in the institution 14 years, 7 years, but most of them not a long time because the rules are very strict on people working in the institution. They literally work 6 days a week, 7 days a week. They have only 1 day off, and even then they're a bit restricted on it. The teachers have to work all day. When they're not teaching, they're supervising the children. So when I mentioned the regimen, the children are literally marched from one activity to the next with bells being rung, and it's the teachers that have to march them. The matrons, they are all single, the teachers. The matrons tend to be, in a sense, I guess we call them as lower middle class or upper working class. Some of them stay for like 25, 30 years. So they're there for a long time. By the 20th century, the orphanage and the LBS both changed their institutional model and established what they call lady superintendents. They do that deliberately to try to attract lower middle class women into these positions. And in the LBS, two of them literally were former committee members. So this interesting situation where middle class women, sometimes, especially when they become widows, fall on hard times, let's say, and then they literally took a job as the matron in the institution. So that was interesting. But they also have women who work with the children. They sleep in the dormitories. Those are all working class women. Some of them the mothers that were admitted.
One more quick question. How rigid were the boundaries between Catholics and Protestants in these institutions? Did some Catholic mothers send their kids
No,
to
no,
Protestant institutions?
very,
Did
very
the
rigid,
institutions employ Catholics?
very rigid.
Okay.
The Protestants were so worried. The Catholic network is very, very large, right? I mean, the Protestants are in a majority in the city only for a 10-year period. Otherwise, Catholics are always in a majority. They're so worried about proselytism or the threat, well, let's say of being seen to proselytize, that Catholics might then do that to their children, that they never admit a Catholic child. And if a child is found to be Catholic, they immediately send them out. There were a couple of instances where one Catholic mother who tries to get her children out of the institution, but the children are all baptized Protestant. She comes to the charity. She's one of the people that literally steal the children over the wall of the institution. Those children are taken to St. Pat's, the Catholic orphanage. The orphanage takes them to court, and they get the children back. So there really were a couple of instances. Once a girl runs away, they find her, or someone finds her in the Grey Nuns institution, and the lawyer, the POA lawyer, asks for her back, and they literally take her back. So no, there's very strict rules against admitting Catholics and letting Catholics go to. So the only time the charities tended to not allow a child to go home to their parents or to their relatives was if they were Catholic, particularly if they were going to put them into St. Pat's. Okay, so that they would never allow. They really saw that as a threat to the child's soul, and they would keep them in the institution and violate parental rights.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that, Janice. That was a fascinating talk. It's 12:59, so we're running out of time. And thank you to everyone for attending today's event. And
Thank you.
and it's if you would like to sign up for a newsletter, we will share a QR code on the screen. And if you haven't already, you can follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn, the handles of which should also be on your screen. Our evaluation survey will appear in your browsers once we exit this meeting. And in closing, we again recognize the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, Gouvernement du Québec, and our other funders, Canadian Heritage and Concordia University. And thank you to my colleague Anna Hunt for organizing this Lunch and Learn and for her technical support today. See you next time. And our next big event is the forum, the Education Forum in early November. So don't miss that, a 3-day education forum in person. Thank you very much.